Have you ever felt like life keeps throwing problems your way, one after another, until you start wondering if success is even meant for you? What if I told you that every obstacle you face isn't here to break you, but to build the strongest version of you? In this story, you'll meet someone who started with nothing, faced pain most of us can't imagine, and still found a way to rise. If you watch until the end, this story will change how you see every single challenge in your life, because sometimes the things that feel like they're destroying you are actually shaping you for something greater. Ethan sat alone in his tiny one-bedroom apartment, staring at the final notice on his rent. His hands trembled as he thought about the job he had just lost that morning. The weight of failure pressed down on him like a heavy chain. For months, he had been working 2 jobs, barely surviving, yet life seemed determined to push him further into the ground. That night, he skipped dinner, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he had only $10 left. As the city lights flickered outside his window, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe he wasn't meant to succeed. Maybe this was all life had to offer him. But deep inside, a tiny voice whispered that this wasn't the end, that something had to change. The next morning, Ethan walked aimlessly through the city streets, lost in thought. He stopped at a small coffee shop, spending his last few dollars on a cup of black coffee just to feel normal for a moment. As he sat there, an older man with a kind smile approached him and asked if he could share the table. They exchanged polite nods, but the man's next words startled Ethan. "You look like someone carrying the weight of the world. You know, storms don't last forever," Ethan chuckled bitterly. But something about the man's calm voice cut through his hopelessness. The man told him about losing everything years ago and rebuilding his life from scratch. Before leaving, he handed Ethan a small card that read, "When you're ready, call." Ethan stared at it, wondering if this was a lifeline or just another empty gesture. Ethan walked out of the coffee shop, clutching the small card in his hand, feeling torn between disbelief and hope. That night, hunger gnawed at him again, and he stared at the crumpled $10 bill in his wallet. He could buy groceries and stretch them for a few days, or he could risk everything and make a call that might change his life. The card felt heavier than it should, its simple message replaying in his mind. "When you're ready, call." He paced his tiny apartment, anxiety gripping him. The world outside seemed cold and indifferent, but deep down, something urged him to take a leap. With shaking hands, Ethan grabbed his phone, hesitated for a moment, and finally dialed the number. A calm voice answered on the other end, and what they said next would change everything. "Ethan, I was hoping you'd call," the voice said, warmly, as if expecting him. The older man introduced himself as Thomas and invited Ethan to meet him at a local community center the next morning. He said, "I want to show you something." Ethan almost hung up, unsure if this was some scam or a cruel joke, but there was sincerity in Thomas's tone that made him pause. With nothing to lose, Ethan agreed. That night, he barely slept, replaying the conversation in his head. When morning came, he dragged himself out of bed, nerves twisting in his stomach. At the community center, Thomas greeted him with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. "You're not broken," Thomas said softly. "You're just stuck. Let's change that." Those words sparked something in Ethan, a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in months. Inside the community center, Ethan was surprised to see dozens of people, men and women of all ages, gathered around tables, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. The room buzzed with energy, a stark contrast to the loneliness he had been drowning in. Thomas led him to a quiet corner and introduced him to a small group of people who, like Ethan, had once been at rock bottom. One man shared how he rebuilt his life after bankruptcy. A woman talked about overcoming addiction and becoming a mentor. For the first time in months, Ethan felt like he wasn't alone. "We're here because someone believed in us," Thomas said. "Now it's your turn to believe in yourself." Ethan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All he knew was that something was shifting inside him, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Later that day, Thomas sat with Ethan and asked him to share his story. Ethan hesitated, but eventually poured out everything. Losing his job, the bills piling up, the hopelessness that kept him awake at night. When he finished, Thomas nodded calmly and said, "Ethan, your life won't change unless you do. No one is coming to save you, but you have everything you need inside to save yourself." The words stung. He wanted to argue, to blame his circumstances, But deep down, he knew Thomas was right. For years, he had let fear and doubt dictate every move. "We're going to rebuild you," Thomas said firmly, "but it won't be easy. You're going to have to fight harder than ever before." Ethan swallowed hard, torn between fear and curiosity. Could he really turn his life around? The next morning, Thomas handed Ethan a worn-out notebook. "This is where your new life begins," he said. "Write down everything you want to accomplish, no matter how impossible it feels." Ethan stared at the blank page, his hands trembling. He hadn't dreamed in years. Survival had become his only goal. Slowly, he began writing. Small things at first. Get a job, pay off debt, find stability. Then, bigger dreams followed. Own a business, travel the world, inspire others. Thomas smiled as he watched Ethan's hesitant scribbles turn into bold goals. "Now," Thomas said, "we make a plan." That day, Ethan took his first steps, attending job training sessions, committing to early mornings, and pushing through exhaustion. It was painful, uncomfortable, and overwhelming, but something inside him shifted. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Weeks passed, and Ethan pushed himself harder than ever before. He applied for dozens of jobs, attended workshops, and showed up every day at the community center. Slowly, he started to feel proud of his progress. But one rainy afternoon, he received a rejection email from a company he desperately wanted to work for. The disappointment hit him like a punch in the gut. He felt foolish for believing things could change. That night, he sat in his dark apartment, tempted to give up and return to the hopelessness he once knew. But then he remembered Thomas's words. "No one is coming to save you, but you have everything you need to save yourself." Ethan closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and made a choice. He wasn't going back, not this time. Something inside him burned brighter than his fear. The very next morning, Ethan forced himself out of bed and walked back to the community center, soaked in determination. Thomas noticed the fire in his eyes. "Good," he said. "Now you're ready." That day, Thomas introduced Ethan to a friend who owned a small construction company. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Ethan threw himself into the work, arriving early, staying late, and learning everything he could. His body ached, but with each paycheck, he felt stronger, not just physically, but mentally. He began saving every dollar he could, cutting out distractions and focusing only on growth. For the first time, Ethan realized success wasn't about luck, it was about relentless effort. The weight of his struggles began to feel like fuel rather than chains. And then an unexpected opportunity came knocking. One evening after work, Ethan was approached by his supervisor, a man named Mike who had been quietly observing him for weeks. He said, "You've got something rare. Most people quit when things get hard. You don't." He offered Ethan a chance to train for a higher position, something Ethan never imagined would happen so soon. The long hours and physical pain suddenly felt worth it. Ethan accepted and threw himself into learning, staying up late to study safety protocols, project plans, and leadership skills. For the first time in years, Ethan felt proud himself, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't just building a career, he was building a new version of himself. And while doors were opening, Ethan had no idea that his greatest challenge was still ahead. Just as Ethan's life was finally gaining momentum, he received a phone call that stopped him in his tracks. His younger sister, Lily, had been in a serious car accident. She was in critical condition, and doctors weren't sure if she would make it through the night. Ethan rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding, memories of their childhood flashing through his mind. Sitting beside her hospital bed, he felt that old helplessness creeping back in. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Lily was all he had left. He wanted to break down, to give in to the despair that had haunted him for so long. But as he looked at her fragile form, something inside him hardened. He couldn't afford to fall apart now, not when she needed him the most. That night, Ethan held Lily's hand and whispered a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "I'll take care of you. I'll take care of us. We're going to get through this." He barely slept, splitting his time between work and the hospital, running on coffee and sheer willpower. Days turned into weeks, and Lily slowly began to recover, but the medical bills piled up faster than Ethan could pay them. Every shift at work became a battle, but with each paycheck, he chipped away at the debt. He remembered Thomas's words, echoing in his mind,
You have everything you need to save yourself. Now, Ethan wasn't just saving himself, he was fighting for his family. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but his determination was unshakable. He refused to let life break him again. And then an idea sparked in his mind. Ethan's idea was risky, but something deep inside told him it was time. After years of working construction, he'd gained enough skills to start his own small contracting business. He spent every spare moment researching permits, building a business plan,
and saving every dollar he could. Thomas became his mentor, guiding him through every step. "If you're waiting for the perfect moment," Thomas said one evening, "it doesn't exist. You make the moment perfect." With trembling hands, Ethan used his savings to buy tools and register his business. The fear was suffocating, but he remembered how far he had come, from an empty apartment to standing on the edge of something he'd only dreamed of. He had no clients, no guarantees, but he had grit, and grit was enough to take the first step into the unknown. Ethan's first months in business were brutal. He handed out flyers, cold called strangers, and took every small job he could find. There were days he worked 14 hours and still worried about rent, but quitting was never an option. Slowly, word spread about his dedication and honesty. Clients began recommending him, and soon Ethan's schedule was full. With every project, his confidence grew. He hired a small team, including some people he met at the community center, others who had once been down and out, just like him. Together, they built not just homes, but hope. As his business flourished, Ethan realized something powerful. The problems he once cursed had shaped him into someone unstoppable. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. But there was one last step he needed to take to complete his journey. Years later, Ethan stood in front of a crowd at the same community center where his life had changed. His business was thriving, his sister was healthy, and he was no longer the broken man who once walked in with $10 to his name. "Your problems," he said, his voice steady, "are not here to destroy you. They're here to shape you into someone greater." As he looked around the room, he saw faces filled with the same pain and hopelessness he once carried. Ethan knew his story wasn't about success. It was about transformation. He stayed after the speech, shaking hands, encouraging strangers, and handing out cards that read, "When you're ready, call." Life had come full circle. The boy who once felt worthless had become a beacon of hope for others who felt lost. Which part of Ethan's journey touched your heart the most? Was it the moment he hit rock bottom, or the courage he found to rise again? What lesson did you take away from his story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. If this story inspired you, remember that affiliate links are in the description. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful, life-changing stories with the world. Thank you for watching. Your growth is our mission, and together we can turn life's hardest moments into stepping stones for success.